Welcome to another episode of the Startup Junkies podcast. My name is Caleb Talley, Director of Marketing and Events at Startup Junkie. I am joined by my regular co-host, Jeff Amorine and Matthew Ward. But today we are honored to be joined by Mr. Steve Case, co-founder of America Online and Chairman and Chief Executive of Revolution, author of The Third Wave, an entrepreneur's vision of the future. Mr. Case, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
We're very pleased to have you. I wanted to jump right in and talk about some topical subjects, including the op-ed you recently wrote for the Washington Post. In that op-ed, you wrote, Congress needs to stop solely backing efforts to restore the old economic reality and focus on how to develop a new one. Speaking in regards to how, with an aid package, they should keep entrepreneurship in mind. And I wanted to ask you, what role might entrepreneurship play in creating that new economic reality?
Well, as you know, it's critical. I mean, the startups really are the innovators and also the job creators. So if you just focus on existing businesses, you're not going to have the opportunity to really create the companies of the future and the industries of the future. And it makes sense for the first phase of the relief effort for Congress to focus on stabilizing, supporting kind of existing businesses, particularly small businesses. A lot of them are at risk, and having some support there is necessary. But it's not really the full package. That's the first step. The other steps they need to focus more on is not just stabilizing what already existed, kind of looking in the rearview mirror, but figuring out what's going to happen next to make sure new companies can be created in an environment where it is going to become more difficult often to raise the capital necessary to start and scale businesses. So if we want to continue to be growing as an economy, we want to continue to be creating new jobs, we've got to focus on not just existing companies, but new companies. And that's why the more focus on startups is so important.
Absolutely. You also mentioned in there just the need to tackle geographic disparities. You are probably as passionate as anybody else about building venture ecosystems in unexpected places. Could you tell me a little bit about your work in that arena?
Yeah, it started about a decade ago. I was asked to co-chair something in Washington called the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. That led to a series of recommendations, including to create an initiative which President Obama did out of the White House called Startup America, which he asked me to chair. Led to other things like the Jobs Act that passed about 8 years ago, jumpstarting our business startups, kind of updating the rules of the road in terms of raising capital for startups. But then about 6 years ago, we launched an initiative, Rise the Rest, really trying to hit the road and shine a spotlight on cities that were rising and showing real promise. And so far, we've done 8 bus tours and visited 43 cities. And we also created 2 Rise the Rest seed funds that so far have invested in 150 companies in about 75 cities. And we're seeing great momentum. A lot of, as you all know, great talent everywhere, great ideas everywhere. There just isn't capital everywhere, and that's what we're trying to change. And the data for the people who haven't followed this is last year, 75% of venture capital went to just 3 states: California, New York, Massachusetts. 75%. The other 47 states are fighting over the remaining 25%. These are some big states: Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia. They're basically less than 1%. Texas, Florida, 2 of the largest states, are a little under 2%. California alone is over 50%. So it's kind of weird that capital is flowing to so few people in so few places. And that's what we're trying to change. The other overlay is become even more important recently, obviously, is not just focusing on leveling the playing field in terms of place, but also in terms of people. If you look at that data, last year, less than 10% of venture capital went to female founders, over 90% to male founders. And less than 1% went to Black founders, even though Black Americans represent 13% of our country. So something's just a little bit off, and we need to change that and be on the lookout, kind of broaden our aperture, if you will, and look out for great entrepreneurs with great ideas anywhere in the country and from a whole host of different kind of backgrounds. And so hopefully that will be more and more a focus of folks over the next decade. We think it's critically important for each of the communities because of the role startups play in creating jobs, but more broadly for a country, if we're going to have a more inclusive innovation economy where more people in more places really feel like they're part of it, and have an opportunity to have a bright future, as opposed to feeling like they're being left out and feeling like the innovation, the disruption might be benefiting a few people in places like Silicon Valley, but probably going to hurt them, probably kill jobs in their community. So we need to make sure we're going to focus on creating jobs everywhere, opportunity everywhere, and that means backing entrepreneurs everywhere.
Steve, I want to follow up a little bit. Well, first of all, we're true believers. I mean, we are comrades in arms because of where we sit in Northwest Arkansas, and we're real believers.
I've been there many times. We're looking forward to bring our bus there. Hopefully,
yeah, and we're looking forward to that too.
Come next year.
Absolutely, but follow on a couple of points is, so the context I bring is active early stage investor, 9 tech startups over a long career, written a lot of checks, been involved with a lot of funds and whatnot. And the thing that always struck me as an area where we could improve participation was around how we define accredited investors, and the fact that the way that law has been written since the 1970s limits it essentially to the top 1% of the people that are able to write checks. So we have this idea that if you open that up in a way that people could invest their own money, because there's lots more information available for private companies than there ever was when those rules were created, you'd pull a lot of money off the sidelines from people that are active and engaged and could contribute that didn't currently qualify as accredited investors. And moreover, another concept, and I'd just be interested in your reaction, is opportunity zones was a good start, but the rules are so complicated around how you shield capital gains. If they made that available as a shield for ordinary income, you'd get greater participation and investment in those areas from the people that you want the investment to come from, the people that live in and around those areas. I'd just be interested in your reaction on it. Those are 2 areas that we're actually trying to push on our own legislative agenda, and I'd be curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I've been involved, as I mentioned, in the Jobs Act, and it did deal with some of the issues around accredited investors. It did, change the rules around crowdfunding, so you could do equity crowdfunding. But as you said, because of the concern about people being taken advantage of, not full disclosure, because of the fact that investing in startups obviously is risky, and there, the possibility you might lose your money, there was a lot of focus, particularly with the SEC, with the Jobs Act, to kind of keep bad things from happening, kind of protect the investors. And it's obviously some of that's necessary, but sometimes if you focus too much on keeping bad things from happening, you're not enabling good things to happen. And so you got to strike the right balance in terms of how do you open it up and be more inclusive in terms of who can be an investor, and even the idea of only certain people who already are wealthy have the ability to invest in what might be the next Facebook or the next Walmart or the next what have you. Just isn't fair. I mean, it kind of perpetuates some of the same dynamics. So I totally understand that, the need to strike the right balance. I totally understand the importance of protecting investors and having appropriate disclosures, but kind of opening up the innovation economy to more everyday investors, I think, is important. That was one piece of the Jobs Act, and there's still more work to be done. I also spent some time on opportunity zones, was a supporter of that legislation 4 or 5 years ago when it first got introduced. It always had broad kind of bipartisan support. The idea of creating incentives so capital can flow to some of the places where poverty levels are high and investment levels are low, and create an incentive that does result in more companies starting and scaling there. Doesn't also result in terms of neighborhoods being revitalized there with some investment more on the real estate side. I think that is very important. Again, you have to strike the right balance. How do you create the right incentives so more capital flows to places that otherwise wouldn't get the capital? At the same time, make sure the definitions are such it's not a free ride or too easy a ride, and projects that would have gotten funded anyway get funded, and there's just a tax kind of benefit that doesn't really create jobs, doesn't really lift up communities. So these are tricky issues, and I understand that having dealt with them. And the first step is getting kind of legislation passed, but then the battle quickly shifts to the rules of the road and making sure they're written in an appropriate way. And there's still, I think, work to be done on both those fronts. On opportunity zones, the way the rules were written, there is more of a focus right now on investing in real estate in opportunity zones, not as much as I think there needs to be in terms of investing in startups in opportunity zones. And hopefully that will change over time.
Agreed. Yeah. Thank you. That's great.
Matthew?
Yeah. Something I was curious about is when creating a venture ecosystem, there are different aspects to it, such as like human capital, regular capital, all these different aspects. What do you see as being the most important?
It's a mix, and we do have at our Rise the Rest website, we published a number of playbooks based on the lessons we've learned traveling around the country, working with a lot of different entrepreneurs, working with a lot of community builders and startup community kind of leaders in a lot of different cities. And there's a number of different things to focus on. And if you want to simplify it, to me, there are three that I think are critically important. Capital obviously is part of it. That's why we focused with Rise Rest on trying to, kind of drive more capital to more people and more places. How do you, in each market, get some of the money already in that city off the sidelines? Maybe it was made, in real estate or some other oil and gas, some other sector. How do you get some of those folks to not just invest in more traditional investments, but also look at the startups as a potential? So get more of that seed capital locally. How do you create more regional venture funds so they can provide some of that initial capital? And how do you educate some of the coastal funds in places like Silicon Valley about the opportunities in Northwest Arkansas or other parts of the country? So obviously the capital piece is critically important. The second is the talent piece. And there's a real opportunity here, particularly, frankly, given this COVID pandemic, which is over the last half century. If you look at the data, there's been a massive brain drain in many parts of the country. People who wanted to be part of startups, wanted to be part of the innovation economy, growing up in many parts of the country, felt they had to leave where they were and go to the coast. Typically it is Silicon Valley, but sometimes to Boston or New York City or a few other places. And as a result, there's not the same energy in many of those communities. And there are a lot of people in those other places who actually wouldn't mind coming home, wouldn't mind returning to where they either grew up or went to school or have some connection. But historically, in the last 10 or 20 years, there hasn't been a lot of robust entrepreneurial activity in those places, which leads to this brain drain being perpetuated. Now we're starting to see a little bit of the slowing of the brain drain. There are a number of cities where people graduating from universities like Carnegie Mellon and Pittsburgh, for example, now more are staying there. 10 years ago, even most of them would have left. And we're also seeing just the beginnings of a boomerang of talent, the people who did leave returning. And I think that could be accelerated because of COVID. There are people who decided to shelter someplace else other than where they were living. Some of those may decide to stay there and either work for the current company they're working for remotely or perhaps do something different in one of those cities. So this talent piece is critically important. And there's a little bit of this chicken and egg between capital and talent you always hear, where the investors say, well, there is more talent, we'd invest more. And people would say, well, there would be more talent if there was more investment capital. So you got to work on them in parallel. And the third is really a cultural piece, which is how do you create in these communities a real sense of possibility, of optimism, champion entrepreneurs, support the startup community. That is one of the great things about Silicon Valley. There's a sort of anything is possible mentality. As you know, in many parts of the country, they're a little bit more status quo oriented, aren't as willing to kind of take that leap of faith. If an entrepreneur tries something and it doesn't work, they think of it as a failure as opposed to just an experiment that didn't work. And that person could then go on to do something even more interesting and ultimately successful on their next kind of go around. So that cultural point, building more of community, more collaboration, driving more towards that sense of possibility, that embracing rather than fearing disruption is the third piece. So to me, capital, talent, and culture are the three big ones to focus on, but there are many other aspects that are important to watch as well. And Brad Feld, who's a friend, we've worked together on a number of things over the last decade. He actually just came out with a new book last week, focusing on some of the lessons he's learned from building startup communities in Boulder and other places. So there is a lot of work, and you folks are doing a lot of this yourselves, I know, in terms of what's happening in different cities. We published a lot of it with Rise and Rest. There are many other books on it. The most important thing is just to, as a community, say, this is a moment, this is our time, and we're going to focus more on startups, focus more on entrepreneurs, focus more on driving more innovation, and ultimately, that's our best path to creating a strong community 25 years from now that really is seeing a growing economy, strong economic growth, as well as strong job growth. One data point that I remember being startled by a decade ago when I started getting into this is about half of the Fortune 500 companies turn over every 25 years. It's just the nature of what happens in terms of a disruption. Some fall by the wayside, others emerge. So as a community, if you're just focused on your existing companies and you're not focused on new companies, just statistically, about half of those aren't going to be there 25 years from now. What are you going to replace that with? Which is why seeding new companies is so important.
Yeah, I mean, as a follow-up to that, imagine if we were all sitting in Detroit in the 1950s when they were on top of the world and dominant in automobiles. If they'd known what the 1970s were going to look like, maybe there would have been a different trajectory in economic diversity and in new starts and in leveraging all that engineering and manufacturing talent. And we think about that a lot locally. We've got the three big pillars locally of retail and supply chain and food and beverage. And candidly, if big retail, if it took a hiccup, it would be a big problem for the area. So adding that diversity of having $100 million businesses that aren't directly tied to the success or failure of one large company in one sector is hugely important. And so we agree with you. I mean, I've read a lot of what Brad Feld's read, and I've kind of grown up in this ecosystem and in parallel with what he's done in Boulder. We're going to put out our own spin actually in a book end of the year, talking about how we did it here. Very related themes. And the one thing that I'd be interested in your thoughts on, and you mentioned the large companies, the fourth pillar, if we will, that we think a lot about is how you get those flagship enterprises to engage and realize that their own competitive advantage may not be inside their own four walls, but may be in that startup community. I'd be curious on your thoughts on that point.
No, absolutely. But first of all, on the Detroit point, it's a great point. People don't think about this, but 100 years ago, when Detroit was rocking and rolling, arguably the most innovative city in the country, probably in the world, Silicon Valley back then was just fruit orchards. They weren't growing startups; they were growing fruit. And Detroit was had it all. It was the car was the hot technology moment, and Detroit was the place to be. And so people flocked to Detroit, and houses were built and roads were built, and everybody wanted to be part of the automobile revolution, and Detroit was the big beneficiary. But then it did get a little, complacent, did focus just on that one industry. Competition globally intensified and lost its way and went from being the Silicon Valley of its time to actually a bankrupt city, 5-6 years ago. It's fought its way back, actually now has a very strong startup culture. Dan Gilbert, the entrepreneur, started Quicken Loans, other businesses, has done a fabulous job. The mayor, the governor, there's been a broad even foundations like Kresge have done some great things in terms of supporting that. And that's why Detroit is on the rise. But it is a good example. These things rise and fall, and it's a community. If you're not focusing on the future, you're not kind of going where the puck is going, not where it already was, you're going to be left out. In terms of big companies, it's a terrific point. It's one of the things I wrote about when I wrote the book, The Third Wave, a few years ago, that if big companies want to stay big, they need to stay agile and relevant. And while they do have a lot of smart people working for them, more smart people work for somebody else. So how do you connect to different people and build almost a network around your company, like an API around your company, so you can get different ideas and see technologies early and forge partnerships early. And so the successful companies now really recognize that and are trying to embrace what's happening in the startup community. And 10, 15, 20 years ago, they feared what was happening in the startup community. They worried that one of those crazy entrepreneurs were going to do something might disrupt their business. So the best thing would be to ignore them and hope they would just go away. Well, now they realize that some of those are going to grow in a way that are going to create interesting opportunities to accelerate their own growth and make sure they do remain a leader. And so this partnership between big companies and small companies is critically important. And as you say, communities that understand that and help facilitate that are the ones that are going to be beneficiaries. I've seen even the progress in Northwest Arkansas, particularly in Bentonville, is a good example of that, in part because of some members of the Walton family, Tom, Olivia Stewart, and others focusing on investing more in Bentonville. It's now has a stronger startup community, obviously many others participating as well. And they're not just focusing on, Walmart as this big giant that happens to be based there. They're also focusing on how do you create a city that more people want to live in, to be a magnet for talent and capital, and create a more diversified economy and figure out ways to partner with some of those crazy entrepreneurs. So that model, that mindset is critically important.
That's great.
And you painted a picture kind of, of a time when Detroit was the most innovative city in America and Silicon Valley was orchards. You've seen so much of the country on your tours and seen, budding ecosystems. What would you say if you looked at a crystal ball and just from your experiences, what part of the country might be the next Silicon Valley?
Well, I view it a little more broadly. It's a little bit because we have invested invested in so many different cities. It's almost asking a parent, like, what's your favorite child? You want all your kids to have an opportunity to be successful. So
Sure.
But you know you have one.
root for all of it. But there are some cities that are, obviously showing some, momentum. And I mentioned Detroit, what's happened there in terms of the turnaround is strong. What's happening in Indianapolis in terms of enterprise software, the success of Exact Target and Salesforce and others has been interesting. Minneapolis, we're seeing a lot of interesting things happening. Denver, Atlanta, Washington, D.C. There are a lot of cities that are really emerging. And so I don't think it's going to be one or two. I think it's going to be a diverse mix of cities. But it kind of depends on the city. This is the kind of the key message when I'm meeting with CEOs in these cities or mayors in these cities or governors in various states. I'm pretty sure the rest will rise. I'm pretty sure over the next 10 or 20 years, we will have a more dispersed innovation economy. It won't be so reliant on Silicon Valley. I'm pretty sure talent flows and capital flows will change. I'm pretty sure we will be able to, kind of make some progress in terms of leveling the playing field and creating a more inclusive innovation economy. That said, I don't really know which cities are going to really be the winners in terms of rising faster and which might be left by the wayside. And the reality is it doesn't matter where we are today or what I might think. It matters what people in the community decide to do. And if they really, with vigor and energy and excitement, say, this is the moment and we're going to focus more on startups. And you get the universities working with the big companies, working with the small companies, with support of the mayors and governors and foundations and others, and you create that momentum and you drive that collaboration and you attract the capital you need to back the companies and you win the battle for talent and you focus your culture on more creativity and collaboration, you will be a winner. And so this is still early. It's sort of like the second inning. It's kind of early to call the game. It depends on what happens in innings 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And so communities right now, I just say game on. You have an opportunity to rise up. You have an opportunity to create a much stronger, more vibrant, growing, kind of prosperous, inclusive community by focusing more on entrepreneurs, focusing more on startups. If you don't, others will, and you'll regret not seizing this moment.
As a follow-up to that, Steve, one thing is, and I think Brad Feld talked about this in the original Startup Communities book, where he said it's at least a 20-year march where the first year restarts every year for the first 10. So it's really 30. And then if you roll it back in Silicon Valley, that's been a 70-year march. If you think about when Major General Draper came back from running the Marshall Plan and all that, Fairchild Semiconductor and all that. So a lot of times when people say, well, are we going to be the next Silicon Valley? It's like, no, first of all, it's early days, but we'll be our own unique region with our own attributes. The other thing I'd add to that, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, is in the economic development world, people get very comfortable with the idea that we're going to compete to attract in a plant or a big industry or whatnot. I really think that focusing on startups and small business is kind of the money ball play for economic development. It's way less money, it sticks, and you're organically building something in the region. But that DNA, the local DNA of the people and believing it's possible is key. If they're waiting on Superman to parachute in, another big plant, they're not going to get there. If they're willing to kind of act rather than waiting to be acted upon, they will. And so I think the point you made about the culture and the coalition of willing and wanting to is really hugely important. That's what we've seen.
I totally agree. Sure. We saw this with a couple of years ago with the Amazon second headquarters search effort. I think it was 235 cities applied to. And I understand why they'd apply. If you're a mayor or somebody, if you don't apply, people would criticize you. But what I said at the time was if they took half of the time and energy they put into making the Amazon bid and half of the money they put on the table as economic incentives to lure Amazon and focus that on their startup community, they might create the next Amazon. So there is too much focus on existing companies. How do you get them to move their headquarters or open a new headquarters or open a factory or open a customer service center or open a logistics center? And some of that should happen, but there's way too much focus relatively on that and way too little focus on the startup community and backing the little companies, some of which will end up being the big companies of tomorrow. So shifting that economic development mindset to focus more and more on new companies, not just on established companies. Exactly what we were talking about earlier in terms of Congress and relief packages. Yes, you have to focus on existing companies, certainly supporting small businesses, but you also have to focus on new companies. You aren't going to like the way things turn out. That's true for individual communities as well. The other thing that drives me crazy, just look at it from more of a national kind of level, this economic battle in terms of trying to get, one state wins, another state loses in terms of getting somebody to shift their headquarters. That's zero sum for the country. There's no benefit to the country. It's like a modest win for one state, a modest loss for another state, no gain for the country. So we really need to focus on the businesses of tomorrow, the industries of tomorrow, which means focusing on entrepreneurs and backing startups. So to me, all these things come back to that kind of same central point, which is you can't just rest on your laurels. You can't just look in the rearview mirror. You can't just focus on your existing businesses. Certainly, you should respect them and celebrate them and help them, but you also have to focus on the new businesses. And even Sam Walton, the story of starting a little discount store and near Bentonville. Who would have thought that Walmart would become such a global giant? Who's the Sam Walton of right now? How do we make sure that that entrepreneur has ability to raise the capital they need, attract the talent they need, get the partnerships they need, so they can take what the little idea that seems a little crazy and has the potential to turn it to a potentially big company, maybe one of the Fortune 500 companies of tomorrow.
Mr. K, something I was curious about was, if you're my age, I'm about 24, and had $500,000, what would be your startup idea?
I probably focus on healthcare. I think because it's 1/6 their economy. It's kind of broken. It's relatively inconvenient. It's kind of expensive. Outcomes aren't that great. Technology can play a role. New business models can play a role. Bringing innovative mindset can play a role. So I think that's one area. We've made a number of investments in that space. A company in Chicago called Tempest, for example, is doing really well, focused on oncology. The founder, who had success in other businesses, he was a co-founder of Groupon, for example. His wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. He talked to a bunch of different doctors. He got a bunch of different advice that was conflicting. He said, "Well, this is crazy." He dug more into it, realized that people do get a cancer diagnosis. And MD Anderson in Texas, was one of the best cancer hospitals in the country, says when people come there for a second opinion, 25% of the time they reverse the first opinion. 25% of the time, somebody somewhere made a wrong diagnosis, and this is somebody's life is hanging in the balance. So he decided to start this company that uses data to be much more precise in terms of the diagnosis. Therefore, it can be much more precise in terms of the specific therapies that are recommended. That's just one of many examples. But the other thing I would say is, and it ties in with our investment thesis really at Revolution, really every sector of the economy is up for grabs. The first wave of the internet, getting everybody online, companies like my company, AOL, kind of was that, just that building the on-ramps and connectivity. The second wave was mostly building apps and software on top of the internet, Facebook, Google, things like that. And obviously, there's been a lot of success there. The third wave is really when the internet meets the real world, and it is healthcare, it is food and agriculture, it's smart cities. It's a bunch of things that are pretty fundamental parts of our lives and pretty significant parts of our economy. And they changed a little bit in the first wave and a little bit more in the second wave. I think are going to change a lot in the third wave. So there really is opportunity, all across the economy. And my belief, it ties in with the rise of the rest, is it's going to be more important in this third wave to have domain expertise and credibility, because partnerships are going to be critically important. And that's going to advantage some of these rising cities where they really do have expertise. One company we backed in Chattanooga called FreightWaves is focused on building essentially a data platform, kind of like Bloomberg, for the trucking industry. Well, guess what? Many of the big trucking companies are headquartered in Chattanooga. So if you're going to build a Bloomberg for the trucking industry, being in Chattanooga, understanding trucking, kind of important. And so that's an example of they have an advantage over a company in Silicon Valley or New York City or other places, because they're centered in a place that really understands trucking. I think a lot of the interesting things happening in agriculture, ag tech, are going to be in places like kind of Nebraska and Missouri and Arkansas, which really understand farming. I've been doing it for like a couple hundred years and actually understand the dynamics and really understand what problems need to be solved, and really can establish the right trust and partnership. So I think there's opportunity really across the whole landscape. So which is going to be a very fertile period of innovation for entrepreneurs, but we need to make sure, which goes back to the point we started with, that we really do level the playing field and really people can, if they have an idea, take that idea, and if they need to raise capital, figure out ways to raise capital. If they need to figure out partnerships, figure out ways to connect to people that could be helpful in terms of building those partnerships. That's really the trick here. The opportunities to innovate, the opportunities to disrupt are huge in really every sector of the economy. But we need to make sure everybody who wants to be an entrepreneur has that opportunity. Everybody really has a shot at the American dream.
You know, what's the one biggest thing during the pandemic where you said this particular adversity has exposed some opportunities that might have not been obvious going into it? I mean, there's a few I can think of, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on
there's
that.
a bunch. Obviously, living in a more of a remote world, and in our case, kind of being on Zoom. I think a lot of people now are thinking about work in different contexts. There probably will be an acceleration of people working remotely, either full-time for a company or doing kind of more freelance kind of work. There are a lot of companies that are going to be building more vertical versions of Zoom, whether it be for classrooms or board meetings or other kinds of specific verticals. There's going to be a whole focus on kind of hybrid offices. When things get back to normal, some people will return to the office. Some people actually will choose to continue to work remotely. It's going to be super tricky to manage that in terms of bridging it so that the people who are working remotely don't feel like they're missing out. They're not like in the room where it happens kind of dynamic. So that's a whole area that's going to see a lot of innovation. We have a company we backed called Convene that's doing some interesting things in that space. We've also seeing interesting things in telehealth that's clearly accelerated dramatically. When your doctor's office is closed, but you need some kind of diagnosis, you have to embrace telehealth. That has resulted in a lot of people who've never tried it and probably weren't particularly predisposed to try it, and it turned out it works pretty well. And so as a result, there's been an acceleration there. A company we back, Talkspace, is doing that in terms of digital mental health. That's another example of an acceleration. We've seen an acceleration in certainly in online learning, a bunch of companies doing interesting things there and trying to figure out what is the right way to manage a classroom. And it is harder than just turning on Zoom. And so the first wave when school shut down in the spring was, well, let's just do these classes on Zoom. I think the second wave will be more refinements to that. So it actually works better for the students and works better for the teacher. A lot of innovation is going to be happening there. I've also seen a real acceleration in gaming and a variety of different companies are showing real momentum there. E-commerce is another one, obviously with the success of the Amazon, Walmart, the big players, but also a lot of other kind of smaller players have really seen a growth. One of the companies we backed, actually based in Texas, Big Commerce, just went public last week, quite successful public offering, and they're basically providing a platform that enables businesses to provide e-commerce in a scalable kind of way. So these are all businesses that were started many years ago and were showing nice growth pre-pandemic, but it kind of did hit a tipping point, and their growth has accelerated because of the pandemic. Now, obviously there are many businesses that have been badly hurt, many small businesses, restaurants, other things that had to shut down. Some of them are not going to reopen. So, the impact this pandemic has had on our economy, a lot of people's lives is significant and really obviously unfortunate. But there are also some examples where it's actually turned out to be an accelerant for some businesses. And the question is, when we get through this next phase and hopefully the vaccine and other things and are back to some more sense of normal, maybe in a year or so, how many of these trends persist? What other things emerge in the process?
That's really good.
And you gave some advice for a 24-year-old today. If you could go back in time and give advice to yourself when you were 24 years old or younger, somebody that as you were beginning your entrepreneurial journey, what would it be?
Well, there's some lessons I learned, and it's part of the reason I wrote a book a few years ago based on my AOL experience. I was lucky, actually. When I was in college, I decided I wanted to be part of building the internet. And back then, in 1980, when I was graduating, it was still more of a concept limited to government agencies, educational institutions. Consumers weren't on the internet, businesses weren't on the internet. But I just remember reading a book by futurist Alvin Toffler called The Third Wave, and he was talking about the agriculture revolution was followed by the industrial revolution. He was predicting this next thing would be the digital revolution, the technology revolution, the computing revolution. I said, yeah, that's right. I want to do that. But when I graduated, actually, there were no internet companies to go to work for because it didn't really exist yet. And there wasn't really a startup culture back then. So it wasn't like I could start something on my own. So I ended up working for a couple of big companies, Procter & Gamble in Ohio, Pizza Hut in Kansas, and then moved to the Washington, D.C. area to join a little company which failed. But two of the people I met there, and I ended up starting America Online in 1985, so 35 years ago this summer. I thought when we started, even though it was still early, only 3% of people were online at the time. Those 3% were online an average of 1 hour a week at the time. So it's still pretty early. That the idea of the internet was so obvious that, of course, everybody would embrace it and want to get online. It took us a decade to finally break through and get noticed. And so one of the lessons I learned was perseverance. Another lesson was partnerships. I realized you couldn't do it on your own. You had to establish partnerships. And I also learned that policy was important. There were a number of things when we got started that needed to change from kind of a regulatory kind of standpoint. So I realized as I look back in that decade that sometimes revolutions happen in more evolutionary ways, and you really have to take the long view. You really do need to be passionate about it because you're going to have to persevere. There's very few overnight successes when you're dealing with systems level change. So those are some of the lessons, kind of taking the long view, not expecting an overnight success, recognizing that it's not just about you, it's about the team you build, and more importantly, the partnerships you forge around your company, the network you build around your company is critically important.
Caleb, I'm going to have a final question because I can't resist. So you obviously are exemplar entrepreneur. We've read about, we know the story. I was actually back on the East Coast when you were building a lot of AOL. I was in the telecom space, and I read with interest when you guys were acquired by Time Warner, when that merger came together, I should say. I know it wasn't a straight acquisition. As a true entrepreneur, and how scrappy you had to be, how was it once you got into realizing you were part of this larger machine, and how did you deal with that? A lot of people wonder about
it. It was
exit.
tough. Strategically, there's the backstory. We went public, AOL went public in 1992. Market value then was $70 million. 7 years later, it was $160 billion, the best performing stock of the decade. And we were really kind of firing on all cylinders. But we recognized we're the leader in dial-up access. It was called narrowband back then. We didn't really have a path to broadband, and we didn't own cable systems. We didn't really have a way to kind of provide that path to broadband. So that really led to the merger with Time Warner, and which strategically made a lot of sense. But it did take us from being kind of a passionate entrepreneurial company, kind of playing offense, to being a much larger conglomerate. Too often really playing defense. I did step aside as CEO as part of that deal, so I had to kind of walk away from running AOL or other parts of the business. And so there's no question it was frustrating watching some of the opportunities that I thought should be pursued, some of the paths that I thought we should take not being taken. And as I step back, I realized there is some difference between kind of startups and big companies, and big companies focus on managing, startups focus on imagining. And as I said before, big companies often are playing defense. Small companies, startups are playing offense. I just concluded I'm better playing offense. I'm better kind of trying to kind of focus on building the future, imagining the future, not just managing what's there, but imagining what could come next. And that led me to focus on really backing the next generation entrepreneurs through revolution, and particularly trying to drive this rise of the rest so that more people, more places really do have the opportunity to start companies and pursue the American dream.
Thank you for all that you're doing. I mean, it's we appreciate it, and we're glad. We're looking forward to when you come back, when the world returns.
Well, I'm looking forward to returning. It's a great place in that Northwest Arkansas. A lot of great things happening more broadly in the region. When we do that tour, it'll also be Tulsa and Oklahoma City, Wichita, St. Louis, some great cities that we really were looking forward to visiting. I've been to all of them myself, but bringing our whole team and our whole Rise of the Rest bus and our entourage. But we had to postpone that obviously because of the pandemic, but we look forward to rescheduling it and hitting the road and seeing you all, kind of face to face as soon as we possibly can. But thanks for all you're doing to really help support the ecosystem and, locally, but also kind of through this podcast and other things, educate other cities, other entrepreneurs about what they can do to build stronger startup communities and build some of the companies of the future.
You bet. Thanks again for coming on today. It's really been great talking to you.
Thank you. Stay
All right.
safe.
You bet. You too.
it.
We'll see ya.